Welcome back to the Deep Dive, everybody. Today we're going to be looking into something pretty wild. It's a court ruling out of Belgium, and well, to be honest, it's one of those things that just kind of makes you scratch your head at first, you know?
Yeah, definitely a head scratcher for sure. So a student was found guilty of, raping another student, but the court decided not to give him any punishment.
Yeah, that's the part that's really tricky to wrap your head around, right? I mean, guilty but no punishment. It seems kind of counterintuitive at first glance.
Absolutely. And, huge thanks to you, the listener, for actually sending this our way. I mean, it's definitely one of those things that just kind of screams deep dive,
Use of
right?
time. So for this deep dive, we're going to be really focusing on this transcript we got from BNR. It's a Dutch podcast, I guess you could call it, that covers all sorts of stuff: law, media, politics.
Yeah, they always have really interesting guests too. And for this episode, they had, let's see, a lawyer, an advocate, and then a criminal defense lawyer.
Yeah. So really good mix of perspectives on this whole thing.
Right. So I think for us, the mission here is to really kind of unpack everything. Like, what was the court's reasoning? How does this relate to consent and sexual assault? And then how's the media playing into all this?
Definitely. Because, you see those headlines, you see those initial reports, and it's easy to just get caught up in the outrage, right? But there's always more to the story.
Always. I mean, I know when I first saw the headline, I was like, hold on, what?
Same here. And then there was that one quote that really just kind of blew up online. Um, the court mentioned that the student was, still young, has no criminal record, and is a talented person both privately and professionally.
Yeah, that one really got people fired up, understandably so.
And honestly, I can't say I blame them. I mean, reading that initially, it's hard not to feel a sense of, I don't know, almost like injustice.
For sure. And to be totally honest, we kind of had the same gut reaction.
Hmm.
But as we got deeper into the transcript, into the actual details of the case, things started to get a lot more complex, you know?
Yeah, the BNR panel really emphasized that this whole thing boils down to the issue of consent.
Right. And consent is something that's becoming more and more central to how we discuss and understand sexual offenses, both in Belgium, the Netherlands, and beyond.
And for anyone who might be, a little fuzzy on the definition, consent basically means that there's a clear and active agreement to engage in sexual activity.
Right. It's not just about the absence of a no. It's about a definite, enthusiastic yes.
Okay, so in this specific case, the victim had absolutely no memory of the sexual encounter whatsoever. And according to the court documents that the BNR panel was referencing, this amnesia was due to extreme intoxication. Like she had consumed at least 2 bottles of wine.
Whoa. Okay, so 2 bottles of wine, that's a lot. That's definitely enough to make someone incredibly vulnerable. And the perpetrator in this case, he actually gave a pretty detailed account of the whole evening. So they met at this Halloween party, and he described her as being, very unsteady on her feet, like she couldn't even walk without his help. He walked her back towards her student housing, but she couldn't get in. So he said that he offered to let her stay at his place.
And his version of what happened next is that they started kissing, which he claims was consensual, and then things progressed to sexual activity. He even specifically mentioned missionary and spooning positions and said that he asked her if she wanted to have sex, even, specifically mentioning penetration without a condom.
So this is where things get really, really murky. I mean, the victim has no memory of any of this, so it's impossible to say whether she consented or not. And as the BNR panel pointed out, in a similar case in the Netherlands, there's this idea of a double confirmation of consent, which basically means you need more than just one person's word to prove that both parties were on board.
Okay, so despite all of this, the court did find the student guilty of rape.
Yeah, and the BNR folks made it really clear that under Belgian law, and increasingly under Dutch law too, rape is defined as any act of sexual penetration without consent. And it's super important to understand that just because someone doesn't resist doesn't mean they're consenting.
Right, that's a huge distinction that needs to be made.
Absolutely. And the court's reasoning here basically rested on this idea that if someone is so intoxicated that they can't express their will, then they can't give consent. So this case, it wasn't really about, physical force or someone being threatened. It was about the victim being completely incapacitated.
And that brings up a really difficult question, right? Like, how do you judge intent? How does the legal system determine what someone knew or should have known about the other person's level of intoxication and whether they were actually capable of giving consent?
That's exactly what the BNR panel was grappling with. They talked about the difference between being a plort, which is like a jerk, or, someone who acts like a real sleazeball, and actually committing a crime. Like, is sleeping with someone who's clearly wasted just a morally bad thing, or does it cross the line into criminal territory? And they were also talking about how the law is starting to recognize this idea that if someone should have known the other person was too drunk to consent, then they could be held responsible.
Yeah, that's a really important point, and I think that's where a lot of the public anger stems from in this case, right?
Hmm.
Like, okay, he was found guilty, which means the court recognized that what he did was wrong, but then they don't give him any punishment. And the B&R panel explained that the court used this legal provision that's similar to Article 9A in Dutch law, where they can find someone guilty but choose not to impose a sentence.
Right. And they gave a bunch of reasons for why they did that. They mentioned the student's age, the fact that he didn't have any prior criminal record, and they even talked about how he has a promising future ahead of him, as a medical student. And they also considered his expressions of remorse.
And it makes you wonder if they were also thinking about the impact that a criminal record would have on his ability to actually become a doctor.
Ugh.
I mean, most places require a clean record, and there's that whole oath of integrity that doctors have to swear.
Yeah, and the BNR panel mentioned that the defense actually specifically asked for a suspended sentence to protect his career.
It does feel like a bit of a Polder verdict, as they say, which is basically like a compromise.
Right, they're trying to acknowledge the crime while also trying to avoid totally derailing this guy's life.
But of course, anytime you have a compromise, someone's going to be unhappy, right? And in this case, that led to an appeal being filed, probably because of all the public backlash.
Yeah, I mean, people were outraged. And it's interesting, the BNR panel mentioned that, according to what they had gathered, the victim's main goal was to have the crime officially recognized.
Which technically the guilty verdict did achieve, right?
Yeah.
Plus, she was also awarded damages.
Exactly. But that doesn't mean that people aren't going to be upset about the lack of punishment. And this whole thing got even crazier when you bring social media into the mix. The BNR panel spent a lot of time talking about this Belgian YouTuber, IT Thai, who basically named the student and shared his picture online.
They called it eigenrichting, which is like
Right.
taking the law into your own hands. And they were really critical of that, comparing it to public shaming. It's like, we have a legal system for a reason, and this guy's just bypassing all of that.
Yeah, they use this term cloud to describe this online frenzy, and it's a pretty apt metaphor. It's like this storm of outrage that just kind of descends and makes it hard to see what's real and what's not.
And to make things even more complicated, the BNR panel pointed out that this YouTuber actually has prior convictions himself. So his actions in this case could actually end up landing him in more legal trouble,
Yeah.
for defamation or libel. We're seeing this kind of parallel justice system playing out online, where people are judged and punished outside of the courts.
It's a really interesting phenomenon, and it definitely raises a lot of questions about, how we handle these kinds of situations in the digital age. And then, of course, there's the role of traditional media in all of this.
Yeah, the BNR panel was pretty critical of some of the initial reporting, like from outlets like Newsblad. They were questioning whether those early reports really capture the nuances of the court's decision.
And that's a huge responsibility that the media has, right? To explain these complicated legal cases in a way that's both accurate and comprehensive, especially with a case like this that's so sensitive and controversial. There's this constant balancing act between reporting the facts from the court documents and providing enough context so that people can actually understand what's going on.
And the BNR folks made this really interesting comparison to sex education. They talked about how simplified information about sex, like, the whole Linda Kriebels thing, can get really distorted online. And it made me think about how dangerous overly simplistic reporting can be,
Hmm.
especially in today's digital world where information spreads so quickly.
It's like that game of telephone we used to play as kids. The message gets passed along, and by the end, it's completely different from what it started out as. And the BNR panel also talked about how the legal system itself is starting to recognize the need to communicate more clearly with the public. They even mentioned how a press officer from the Court of Appeal went on a celebrity news program, which is kind of wild. But it shows that there's this growing awareness that they need to do a better job of explaining their decisions.
So to kind of wrap things up, it's clear that this case is a lot more than just a shocking headline. It's about the challenges of proving consent, especially when alcohol is involved. It's about how the legal system tries to balance different factors when deciding on a sentence. And it's about the huge impact that social media and the news have on shaping public opinion.
Yeah, this deep dive has really shown us that there's so much more to this story than meets the eye. It's a reminder that we need to be careful about jumping to conclusions and that we need to look beyond those initial emotionally charged headlines.
So here's a few things for all of you listening to think about. As a society, how do we balance holding people accountable for their actions while also recognizing that a conviction can have lasting consequences, especially for young people just starting their careers? How should the legal system handle cases where someone is found guilty but the court chooses not to punish them? What responsibility do we all have to ensure that consent is clearly given and received, especially when alcohol is involved? And how can we, both as individuals and as a society, promote a more nuanced and informed understanding of these complex legal issues in this digital age where information is everywhere?
We really appreciate you joining us for this deep dive.
And we hope that you'll keep thinking about these questions long after the episode is over. We'll see you next time.
See you then.